And now up next is The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. So Jody and Mark are staying with their grandparents and their farmhand Stanley, along with Stanley's son Styx. Stanley has this book, a book of really superstitious and honestly kind of evil things. We find out that he made a bunch of scarecrows and he is essentially blackmailing Jody and Mark's grandparents. If they don't do what he says, then he's going to unleash the scarecrows on them. And so scattered throughout the book are both fake scares and pretty real scares that involve the scarecrows. Stanley is taking his book as gospel. Everything that he's reading, he takes it super seriously. They want to go fishing, and he makes sure that they circle the barn 3 times before they go, because the book says so. And then a lot of really weird things that he does. And then at nighttime, Jody sees these scarecrows, and they start to move a little bit. And then as we come to find out, they actually are alive, and they do walk around at night. Styx talks about what's going on, about how a few weeks before Jody and her brother arrived, Stanley, he read from his book, and he managed to bring the scarecrows to life. So a lot of the fake scares are done by Styx. He's kind of messing with them and kind of moving the scarecrows around a little bit sometimes. But then there are other times where the book is ambiguous enough to imply that it's not Styx. And that's what I really like about this book. Whereas in a lot of other entries in the Goosebumps saga, it would be later they find out that it was actually, in this sense, Styx all along. But this book, it is ambiguous enough to where it could easily be interpreted as it's the scarecrows moving by themselves. And so, thinking that it is Styx who's doing all these pranks on them, Jody plans to dress Mark up as a scarecrow. Her plan is that when Styx is walking by, that Mark will come to life, so to speak, and it will scare him, just to get him back. And so, as Mark is dressed up in the scarecrow outfit, Jody goes out to find Styx, and walking behind her is a scarecrow, and she thinks it's Mark. She says, "Mark, go back to your post." And it turns out it's not Mark. It's really a scarecrow. And then Styx arrives to save her from it, and he explains what's going on. Eventually, Mark comes, and he's in the scarecrow outfit, and he notices that the scarecrows start copying him. He moves his arm, they move their arms. He falls down to the ground, and they fall down to the ground. And then Jody says to Mark, "Hey, pull your mask off." And so Mark pulls his mask off, and all the other scarecrows pull their heads off, but they see that Mark isn't a scarecrow anymore, and so they stop following what Mark does. And so now it's just a bunch of headless scarecrows that are walking towards them. Really scary imagery there. Styx goes and wants to fight the scarecrows off, so he goes and gets 2 torches and starts burning them. And then Stanley kind of wises up a little bit. He says, "I'm not going to ever do that again." So then later in the living room, Jody hears Stanley reading in the other room. And then like a taxidermy bear that the grandma and grandpa had in their house starts moving. It starts coming to life. And then Jody looks at Stanley and says, "What are you reading?" And that's the end of the book. I can't convey even a tiny bit of the creepy details that happen in this book. This book had very scary moments in it, and it was a great book. Next up is Ghost Camp. So Harry and his brother Alex are riding the bus to Camp Spirit Moon. They're the only ones on the bus. And the bus driver tells them to get off and to walk down the path, and then they'll see the camp. And then after that, he just drives away once they get off the bus. So they go to the camp, and it appears deserted. There's nobody there. But then soon after, they meet up with Uncle Marv, the head counselor, and he shows them the Spirit Moon greeting. And so they try being kind of weirded out by it. So they go to their cabin, which also has nobody in it, and Harry finds this sticky puddle right on the floor of a blue liquid that he doesn't know what it is, and realizes that there are a few of them inside the cabin. Then there's kind of them wondering, hey, what is this? What could this be? Before they're called off to the campfire. And they go to the campfire, they all have hot dogs. They meet this girl named Lucy. Harry drops his hot dog into the fire. Lucy just reaches in her whole arm, grabs it, and pulls it out. But she's fine. And so that kind of, in Harry's mind, sets up a little red flag. You know, that's really weird. How can you just stick your hand in a fire? And then Uncle Marv says that he's going to tell the 2 ghost stories of the camp, which honestly are pretty creepy. So the first story is about a counselor who is leading his troop deep into the forest, and the campers are hearing a thumping sound, and it's coming from the ground. Nobody knows what it is. The counselor realizes that they're lost, and then they hear a voice that says, "Why are you standing on my heart?" You realize that it's a monster talking, and the monster opens its mouth and starts eating all the campers. The second story is about all the campers of Camp Spirit Moon one time all gather around the campfire, and then there was a fog that came down and enveloped the whole campfire. All the campers. They couldn't see anything through the fog. It was so thick they couldn't even see the fire. Once the fog went away, the whole camp, all the campers, all the counselors were killed. And then they were turned into ghosts. So they went back to their cabins, and they knew that they could never leave unless they had a body to possess. Then there's a thick fog that comes down, and so it would appear that the events of the second story are recurring. And then the fog lifts, and then all of the other campers are gone. But it turns out that it's just another joke that the older campers are playing on the newer campers. They all were just hiding, and it was some sort of special effect or something for the fog. And so then that night, Harry looks over to some of his bunkmates, and they're floating above their beds, like in the air. That's also really creepy, and he sees more of those blue puddles around and more scary things that are going on. And soon after, they take off their shoes, and they're kind of horsing around a little bit. One of the kids impales his foot with a metal tent pole, and his foot is pinned to the ground. He then just kind of pulls it up, and he says, "Oh, it was between my toes. It's no big deal." But it didn't really seem to be between his toes at all. Then there's another time where another camper takes a fork and shoves it into his neck, and that really creeps out Harry and Alex also. Then there's a soccer game going on, and I think there was a time in that soccer game where like somebody's head was kicked off, or at least seemed to be. And then there's a girl who was sitting at the bottom of the lake, but again, it was just another joke. And so all these jokes, they seem to get scarier and scarier. And so then there's one night where Lucy comes to Harry and asks for help. She tells them that everybody at the camp is a ghost, including her. She says that Uncle Marv's campfire story is actually true about the fog killing all the campers, and everybody is trapped. And she says, "Harry, will you let me to possess your mind and body," pretty much. Of course, Harry's like, "Oh, heck no, you're not going to do that." So she tries to take Harry's body by force, and Harry, being utterly freaked out, he finds Alex and he says, "We need to get out of here." They start running, and then they run into the woods, and then they hear the same thumping sound from the ghost story that was told at the campfire. And then there's this big monster that is trying to eat them alive. It does go into some pretty disturbing imagery of how they were eaten and the monster swallowed them and all this weird stuff, all this creepy, scary stuff. And this is probably the weakest part of the book, they kind of just imagine it away. They kind of say, if we don't believe in it, then it'll go away. And so they disbelieve hard enough to where it just kind of vanishes. Then they hear Uncle Marv ordering the other campers to find the two boys so that they can take their bodies and leave the camp. So they think the same thing for the rest of the campers. We can just imagine them away. We can just disbelieve in them so hard that they'll go away. Lucy arrives and tries to take Harry's body again, and another camper whose name is Elvis, it's actually Elvis, is trying to take over Alex's mind. But then the campers start to fight amongst themselves about who's going to take over the kids' bodies. And then they just kind of disappear into this light, into this big bright white light. Now that all the ghosts are gone, Harry and Alex are free to escape. They walk away from the camp, and Alex is starting to hum, and it's really off-key. It's really terrible, which is strange because Alex is a good singer, and he got that role in the talent show because of it. And so you realize that Elvis actually did manage to get into Alex's body. So this book had very, very scary, unsettling moments. I found this book so engaging. Once I started reading it, I was determined to find out what was going to go on the next page. It was a page turner. Everything about it was making the book more interesting to me, at least almost everything. But this book is very engaging. It was a very enthralling book, and really some quite scary moments in it, including the ghost stories that the book revolves around. Next up is The Haunted School. So Tommy moves into this new town. He goes to a new school, and he makes friends with a girl named Talia. She's always putting on makeup. Always. And he also meets a new friend named Ben. So the book opens with them trying to make a banner for this school dance that's coming up. Almost immediately, the scares begin. Tommy starts to hear voices as he's looking for art supplies for them to make the banner with. He gets lost and he runs into this room which has a whole bunch of statues, 25 statues. But the principal comes in, says, "What are you doing in this room?" There are statue replicas of the 25 children in the class of 1947. It's in memory of those children who mysteriously disappeared after they got their class picture taken. No, he apologizes. He makes his way back to the room, and they put some extra work into their banners. The day of the dance comes around, and Tommy and Ben have to fix one of their banners. It got damaged, and so they go off looking for something to fix their banner. Tommy says, "Oh, hey, I know a shortcut." And so he takes them the wrong way again. They find an elevator. And they get in this elevator. They try to push buttons. It doesn't work until eventually, finally, it starts moving. But it starts moving sideways. And it takes them into another world. A world where there is no color. Everything is black and white. They run into, I think, 5 kids that are all black and white. And they say, "Sorry, we're locked in this classroom, and now you're locked in here with us too. And eventually your colors are going to fade and you're going to be just like us." You realize pretty quickly that these kids are part of the class of 1947. Trying to escape, Tommy and Ben go running out the window. And there they find a whole bunch of other kids, also in black and white, and they are just insane. This is like seriously some of the most disturbing material I've ever read in a Goosebumps book. These kids are dancing and doing their cultish behavior. They're smearing themselves with black goo. They're drinking it, doing all sorts of seriously, really, really creepy things. And so you realize that these kids have formed a cult and they're wanting to drain anybody who comes in here of their color. One of the other kids, one of the nice kids, his name is Seth, he comes out, he finds them, and he brings them back into the safety of the classroom that they're locked into. And then they say, guys, there's no hope. Just try to accept your fate, pretty much. And then they say, well, has anybody ever escaped? And they say, well, yes, one person has escaped, but we don't know how. Tommy suspects that it's one of the tough girls in the school. His name is Greta. Greta's kind of the bully of the school. He suspects her because she had gray eyes, colorless eyes. Soon afterwards, the elevator door opens again, and in comes Talia. The kids there see Talia. They say, oh my gosh, Talia, you're back. It's been so long. Talia is obviously the one who escaped. And that's why she's putting on makeup all the time, because she's trying to hide that she is not in color. She's a black and white kid. So Talia explains that the way that she got out was that one day she opened up her lipstick container and she saw that it was still red. And so she used that lipstick to draw on the wall to make color pictures. But when her lipstick touched the wall, then it created an exit. And so that's how she escaped. And so Talia decides that she's happier with her friends in the gray world, and she says that Tommy and Ben need to get out. And so she again pulls out her lipstick, creates the portal, they escape, and just in the nick of time, right before they were about to completely turn black and white. And so Tommy and Ben, having escaped the black and white world, return to the gym where the class dance is being held. The principal gathers all the kids at the dance and says, let's take a picture. And she says, Mr. Chameleon, you can come take the class picture now. And Mr. Chameleon was the one who took the picture in 1947, right before the class of 1947 all vanished. And so Tommy is freaking out. And so the book ends with this Mr. Chameleon taking their picture. So this book is some of the most disturbing content ever, with the description of this cult that the black and white children have developed. It was seriously terrifying, especially if you put yourself in the shoes of Tommy and Ben who were experiencing it. This is seriously a very scary book. It's also pretty easy to sympathize with Tommy. I think that's happened to a lot of us where we move schools and we want to make friends. So Tommy's a pretty likable character, I think. Another thing that really adds to this book is the race against time. The description of how the color is fading away on Tommy and Ben's bodies and how they need to get back before they're permanently covered in black and white. Very suspenseful, very scary, very good book. Next up is Night of the Living Dummy. So there are twin sisters, Lindy and Chris. They're out for a walk and they find a ventriloquist dummy in the dumpster. And of course it's Slappy. They take it home. Lindy claims Slappy as her own dummy because she's the one who found him. And she starts practicing ventriloquism and gets pretty good at it. Soon enough, Chris starts getting really jealous and says, well, I want to be getting all the attention that you're getting. I want to do ventriloquism. And so their dad brings Chris her own dummy that she calls Mr. Wood. And it gets into this big competition of who's better and all that. And then there are a lot of things that happen that are admittedly quite creepy, but a lot of them are fake out scares. But eventually Chris finds a piece of paper in Mr. Wood's pocket. Of course, it's the Carew Marie O'Donna Loma Milano Carano. Mr. Wood looks up at her and blinks all by himself. Chris tries to put on a show for some elderly people, and Mr. Wood, now being alive, starts to say really horrible things to them. The fact that there's a dummy who's talking on his own is pretty creepy. Chris with Mr. Wood are going to a talent show, and she, of course, brings Mr. Wood to do the ventriloquism, and Mr. Wood goes pretty insane. He starts insulting the lady who's hosting the show, and Mr. Wood just straight up starts projectile vomiting 360 degrees everywhere, and a lot of other really crazy stuff happens. So that night, her dad says, okay, I'm going to take the dummy back. You clearly can't handle it. He locks the dummy up in the closet, and later that night, she's trying to fall asleep, but she hears Mr. Wood walking around, and he kind of proclaims to Chris and Lindy that they're his slaves. And then here it gets straight up violent. Like, Chris gets in a full-on fist fight with the dummy, slugging her in the face, and she's trying to hold the dummy down. Chris and Lindy resolve they have to destroy Mr. Wood. So they try to pull his head off, doesn't work. And then they throw him back into his suitcase, and they go out and bury him in the construction site that's next door. And then the next morning, Mr. Wood is waiting for Chris at the bottom of the stairs, obviously still trying to enslave her. So Mr. Wood straight up threatens to kill them, and he starts strangling the dog. And it gets really descriptive and violent in this part of the book. Chris and Lindy grab Mr. Wood, yank him off of the dog, as the dog is just sitting there dying, and then they throw him right in the path of a steamroller. It smashes Mr. Wood completely. The driver of the steamroller is freaking out. He thinks that he just hit a kid, and Chris and Lindy go over there. They explain, no, it was just a ventriloquist dummy. If you want, you can keep the pieces. And then they just go home. And that's the last we see of him. They arrive back home, and then they're so relieved. Oh, I'm so glad that that's over. And then Slappy, the other dummy, reaches up and grabs them and says, is that other guy gone? And that's the end of the book. Now this book, it's quite a slow book. It takes many chapters for anything exciting to happen, but the reason I rank it so high is because once the scary stuff does start to happen, it is really scary. It is really dark, it's super intense, descriptive and violent, everything that you would expect from a good horror story about a living ventriloquist dummy. It really is a great read. It's pretty phenomenal. If you're patient enough to sit through the first long chapters, then you're rewarded with a very good book. Up next here is Stay Out of the Basement. So Dr. Brewer has just gotten laid off of his job from the university, and so now he's trying to spend all his time in the basement trying to do these experiments, trying to show that the university was wrong in firing him. Mrs. Brewer has to leave to visit her sick sister in the hospital. Then throughout the book, the kids realize that their dad really isn't acting like himself. He's acting more mean to them. He's very impatient. He tries to feed them this disgusting green gunk and expect them to be okay with it. He's eating plant food, and then he starts developing these physical abnormalities, like he starts growing leaves out of his head, and so he'll wear a baseball cap around everywhere, and he starts bleeding green fluid out of his cut, and he absolutely refuses to let them go down into the basement because he thinks that they're going to disturb his work. He eventually just bolts the door shut to keep them from going down there. And then eventually, a man who used to be Dr. Brewer's boss, Mr. Martinez, he comes in, tries to kind of see what he's doing. He takes him down into the basement and never seen leaving the house. So the kids get suspicious and they go down into the basement to investigate, and they find Mr. Martinez's suit. It's down there and hidden. Dr. Brewer explains to the kids it was just hot down there. And so then the next day, as Dr. Brewer is going to pick up Mrs. Brewer, the kids go down into the basement again, and they find the rest of Mr. Martinez's clothes. And they're like, take his coat off, maybe, but take the rest of his clothes off, no way. And so they realize that their father had lied to them. Then they hear this banging down in the basement as they're down there. And they open the cabinet that it's coming from, and they find their dad tied up in there. And then, of course, it's a big debate of which one is the real father, because the other father comes home, and then there are two fathers down in the basement. They have to decide who's who. And Margaret remembers that her dad, the one that they've been living with, was bleeding green, and she thought that was unusual. So she gets a knife, and she stabs one of the dads and sees that he bleeds red. And so she says, well, that is Dad. And when Margaret concludes that the one that bleeds red is her dad, then the other one is screaming, no, you're wrong. The real Dr. Brewer grabs an axe and swings it at the other Dr. Brewer, and he just cuts him in two pieces. And then they see that he's bleeding green, and so they know that they made the right choice. And then a little while later, Dr. Brewer is trashing all the plants. And he says that he doesn't want to do any more of that work with the plants. He doesn't want to do any more of those experiments. And so Margaret hears whispering from a plant that's down on the ground. And it's saying, Margaret, I'm your real father. And that's the end of the book. There was something about this book that was genuinely unsettling throughout its entirety. It could have been the fact that the bad guy of the book is the children's father, essentially, or it could have been the fact that the danger is coming from their own house in their basement, but something was very, very unsettling throughout this whole book. This book does really everything right. I really can't find many flaws with it at all, and if I can, they're quite minor. But this is a very good book.